faith, firearms, freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode 27, brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. CooksHolsters.com. Speaking of Cook's Holsters, I just got back from the Iowa State IDPA Championship in Elkhart, Iowa, which was sponsored by Cook's Holsters. Thank you to Bob Cook for providing some really cool swag to give away. We gave away some gift cards on the prize table and a holster, really cool holster and magazine pouch set that went with a gun that was given away after the match. It was a really long drive, a little over 10 hours one way. And despite wind wreaking havoc on a couple of stages and some frustrating wait times, it was still fun. Thank you to Assistant Match Director Billy Wideline for helping to coordinate the sponsorship with Cook's Holsters, and to Scott Longhorn, my friend, who was one of the SOs who built a really cool boat stage and who treated me to dinner after the match. It was really great spending time with you guys and just relaxing after a long day for me and what I know must have been an exhausting couple of days for them. So thank you both. Well, for the second week in a row, I had prepared an opening monologue and had everything recorded and set up and all the production work done for today's show before going to Iowa. But once again, the war on cops has raised its ugly head and caused me to do a little rework at the last minute on the night before the show is to be released. I still intend to air the original segments, but I just can't release the show without addressing what is yet another senseless attack on law enforcement in Baton Rouge this morning. It'll be Sunday morning by the time you're hearing this. The president spoke as I was driving back from Iowa, and I thought he struck the right tone. I was actually surprised for a change. He didn't get political. After a week of meetings between what he calls community leaders and police and a town hall on network television, it didn't do any good. We had another attack on police by a black man with ties to anti-white groups. And while the president's words today were a welcome change, I'm afraid they're a little too late. Like I said last week, these attacks are an attack on civilization itself, an attack on that thin blue wall that separates ordered society from barbarity and chaos. Even after Dallas, you had numbskulls on national TV at that. I don't know whether you saw the town hall on Megyn Kelly's show on Fox News, actually suggesting that we need to disarm, defund, and disband police. What we need to do is we need to stop fueling these fires of racial hatred. We need to, in the same way that society marginalized and shouted down the racism of white supremacy and anti-Semitism or the KKK, we need to shout down the black supremacist racism of the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, Black Lives Matter. We need to shout down the voices who try to paint every police shooting as race-related. That's not getting us anywhere. We got to recognize, too, that yes, racism does exist. It's part of every culture in every country. The fear of the other, those who are different, it's part of human nature, unfortunately. But it's not exclusive to America, and it's not exclusive to whites. And while there probably are some racist cops, there are racists in every profession and of every color. The overwhelming majority of police officers are good, honest people who want nothing more than to serve their communities and get home safe to their families every night. Eric Holder once said that as a country, we're cowards when it comes to discussing race. Now, he was dead wrong the way he meant it, but he was absolutely right in one respect. We do need to face some very difficult facts about race that are uncomfortable to look at. Blacks make up a very small percentage of the overall population in this country, but they are responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime, and particularly homicide, something like 8 times the murder rate of whites and Latinos combined. And as such, blacks also account for a disproportionate number of the victims of homicide as well. Despite the lies spewed out by the race baiters like Al Sharpton and the Black Lives Matter movement, the majority of police shootings don't involve minorities. Police are actually less likely to shoot minorities, and they're increasingly likely to be shot by black males. Now, if you're a cop, you're more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be shot by police. That's a fact, and it's something we need to face. Now, this isn't because they're black. This isn't a function of racism. This isn't a function of because they're black, they're more likely to be criminals. That's not how it works. It's society that's the problem. It is the breakdown of the family. It is the depravity in our culture that we celebrate, particularly in the black community, that is the problem. There was some group of Hollywood hypocrites, some racists like Chris Rock and Beyonce. They put out this video, 23 ways you can be killed by police if you're black. And what they're trying to do is suggest that blacks get killed for selling cigarettes or walking on the street or selling CDs or for having a broken taillight. And to me, this is just evil, because what they actually know that these are lies. They know that Alton Sterling, a felon and a sex offender who was illegally in possession of a gun, was not shot because he was selling CDs. He was shot for another reason. They know that Michael Brown was not shot because he was walking in the street. They know that Philando Castile, as tragic as that shooting was not shot because he had a broken taillight. None of those men were shot because they were black. And to say so is only perpetuating this dangerous racist myth that leads some to call for the killing of cops. You know how you do get killed by police if you're black, or any other color for that matter? Try pointing a gun at police. Try to attempt to take a gun away from a police officer, like Michael Brown did. Try attacking a police officer with a knife. Try to run over a cop with a car. That'll get you killed. Or make what they call a furtive movement when police think you're armed. Or wave around a fake gun or a toy gun that looks real when you're out in public. In general, break the law, be an ass, resist arrest. Those things will actually get you killed. The 4th commandment calls on us to honor our father and our mother, but it's much more than that. It's about respecting authority. Too many children in this country are raised with no stable 2-parent home. And even if they have just one parent, that one parent isn't really involved. I mean, how often have we heard, oh, he was a good kid. He loved people. He loved cats. He loved dogs. He loved warm hugs. He didn't deserve to die. After that low-life kid got shot while attacking somebody, or robbing somebody, or carjacking somebody, or in the middle of a home invasion. Consider Luther's words from the Large Catechism. Where do so many rogues come from that must daily be hanged, beheaded, and broken upon the wheel? Don't they come from disobedience to parents, because they will not submit to discipline in kindness? And how many times have we seen young men disrespecting the authority of police? Rather than submitting, being respectful and compliant, like I said in last week's show, Learn to say yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. That'll go a long way. But if you don't show respect, if you're hostile, things generally don't go well for you. You have to show respect to earn it. And today, many young men think that they deserve respect simply because of their color or because they're adults. They don't think they owe anybody anything. That attitude starts at home. And until we fix that problem, it really doesn't matter how many eloquent speeches we give, how many new laws or passionate pleas we make. Nothing is going to change. May God comfort the families of the fallen officers in Baton Rouge and bless those who were injured in this awful attack. And may God protect all of our men and women in blue. All right, on today's show, Sergeant Bill is back with another Ballistic Minute talking about the intricacies of tactical reloads. Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense has a tip on how to dress for concealed carry and how not to dress for concealed carry, I guess. Oh, and by the way, check out the show notes for links to Aaron's upcoming training opportunities in the next few months. Use the promo code Lutheran, and you'll get 20% off your registration fee. And finally, Pastor Bennett is back for another segment of Clinging to God and Guns as we take on a pile of really bad logic and even worse theology from a British theologian, which means, guess what? I'm breaking out my worst British accent ever. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss a minute right here on Armed Lutheran Radio.
The National Rifle Association's Eddie Eagle has taken that message to more than 15 million kids nationwide through a program endorsed by dozens of governors and state legislatures. And gun accident rates today are the lowest ever recorded. For 130 years, we've worked to put safety and freedom first. I'm Wayne LaPierre of the National Rifle Association.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill Silvia.
Hey, this is Sergeant Bill. Today's tip is going to be performing a tactical reload. Now, there's two types of tactical reloads. There's a reload with retention and what's commonly referred to as a tack load. Now, a reload with retention, what you're going to do is you're going to release the mag, you're going to pull it, eject it from your gun, pull it out, and you're going to stow it. And then you're going to replace it with a fresh mag. Now remember, while you're doing this, you need to keep the gun up, pull it into your workspace so that you can keep that awareness around and you've got the gun in close to you, and it makes it a lot easier to do all this stuff. Now when you stow it, you can stow it in a vest pocket or a coat pocket, pants pocket, cargo pocket if you're wearing cargo shorts or pants, or you can actually just put it in your waist where you just kind of tuck it in between your waistband and behind your belt or something like that. In the competition world, you're going to take that you were going to replace it with the first magazine off your belt. But in the real world, what you really want to do is, because you're topping off the gun, there's, whatever's happened has happened, and you've got some time and you want to top the gun off, so if something else bad happens, you have a full magazine, ready to go. So in the real world, ideally, you would want to take your rearmost magazine, say if you're carrying 2 or 3, and you take that farthest one back on your belt. And you want to take that one out to put that fresh mag into the gun, and because then if you want to, you could take that magazine out of your waistline, your belt or whatever, or your pocket, and you can put it back on your belt, because worst comes to worst, it's still got some rounds in it, you still might need it, and you can still be effective in the fight. All right, so back to competition world. Your major concern with the reload with retention is there time enough to do this, or is it going to cost you time to do this? Now, most people that have practiced reload with retentions or tack loads or slide lock reloads are going to find that they can do a slide lock reload faster than they can any of the tactical reloads. So if you're at a match and you're thinking, hey, I want to do a tactical reload here, do you have enough time to do it? Is it going to cost you time doing it? Or do you have 2 or 3 or 4 seconds as you're moving behind a cover position in IDPA where you can top off the gun, and it's going to be beneficial because you're actually going to save time for not having to do a reload later? It's just something you need to look at and decide for yourself. Okay, now we'll move on to the tack load. The tack load is very similar to the reload with retention, but what you're going to do is first you're going to grab a fresh magazine off your belt, and you're going to make sure that when you index that magazine, instead of indexing it after you pull it out, you're going to take your index finger that's along the front of the magazine where the bullets point, and you're going to slide it down the side of the magazine. So you're basically going to be pinching that fresh magazine between your index finger and your middle finger. Next, you're going to drop the partially loaded magazine out of the gun, but you're going to catch it. You're actually going to pull it out with your thumb, between your thumb and your index finger. That's why you have that fresh magazine between your middle and index finger. So that way you can use your index finger and your thumb to grab the base of that magazine and pull it out as you're releasing it out of the gun. You don't really want to drop it out and try to catch it because you're probably not going to catch it. Now from here you will rotate and insert that fresh magazine that you're holding between your index and middle finger. And then you will stow that partial magazine just like we did on the reload with retention. Now there's also a second school of thought on doing a tack load. An alternate technique is when you grab that fresh magazine off your belt, you pinch it between your thumb and index finger, and then when you pull the partial magazine out of your gun, you will actually grab it with your 3 remaining fingers between that and your index finger, so that the new magazine you're going to put into the gun is in front of you, so you can actually see it a little better to make that insertion into the mag well. I've tried both of them. They both work equally well. It's just going to boil down to your preference. Try both. See what seems to work better for you. Pick one and stick with it. Okay, your major concern with a tack load is there's more steps in doing a tack load. But in IDPA, once you have a chamber-loaded gun with the magazine seated, you're okay to move from whatever position you may be to another position. It really boils down to, is there time to do it, or is it going to cost you time to do this? Some people are really fast with reload with retention or RWR. Some people are really fast with tack loads. If you practice them, you can get really good at them. Now, there are some matches you might go to, club matches or sanctioned matches, where they'll require you to do a reload with retention in a stage. And if you haven't practiced it, well, you're going to be hurting. So practice them both. Get those tools prepared and ready. Put them in your toolbox so you'll have them when and if you need them. And here's a bonus tip for you, IDPA shooters. When you're doing a classifier and you're at the last stage of the classifier where you're back at the far position behind that Bianchi barricade and you have to shoot from one side of the barricade, perform a tactical reload, and then move up to the barrel, go to your knees, and shoot 2 more shots from low cover. If you do a reload with retention, you can't move until you're completed it. The gun is, the magazine is seated in the gun. If you do a tack load, where you're basically doing that magazine exchange, as soon as the fresh magazine is seated in the gun, you can start running up to the barrel and stow it on the way. So you save a little bit of time there. This has been your Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill. Keep on practicing, people.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.
And welcome back. It's time now for a self-defense tip from Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense.
Hey folks, this is Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense here with your personal defense tip of the week. This week I want to talk to you about something that should be obvious but is often overlooked by members of the gun culture. That is that you should try to dress like a normal human being and not draw attention to yourself. One of the baseline principles of a good personal defense strategy ought to be not drawing attention to yourself in public. This concept is often referred to as being the quote-unquote gray man, and you can Google that term and find some more articles about what that means in more detail. Essentially, you don't want to put all your cards on the table for the potential bad guy to see. If you walk around in the public space with your 5'11 pants and polo combo and your morale patch American flag hat, and you aren't a law enforcement officer or a government contractor, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. If you value personal defense, you should endeavor to look as normal as possible and to blend in with your surroundings. Now, I understand the allure of wearing clothes that display your appreciation for the Second Amendment. After all, we tend to look at our involvement in gun culture much like football fans look at their favorite NFL teams. So you're going to want to wear your Dallas Cowboys shirt if you like the Dallas Cowboys, and since you're a big fan of gun rights, you want to wear the shirt with a gun on it. I understand that. However, you have to temper that with your understanding of personal defense and try to dress yourself in the way that doesn't scream, "I have a gun," because that's not really going to help you avoid conflict, and you're not really concealed at that point from a fully conceptual standpoint. It could have the unintended consequence of actually inviting the conflict that you're seeking to avoid. Finding a good balance is really essential. Now, I'm not saying never wear your NRA ball cap when you go outside, but maybe you don't accompany that NRA ball cap with the IDPA vest and the sheepdog t-shirt with the big picture of the 45 on it. That's not just good advice for personal defense. You can take that as a free fashion tip today, too. Conflict avoidance in appearances not only applies to the way you dress, but it also applies in what you put on your vehicle. It's a known fact that a great number of the firearms that are stolen each year are stolen out of people's vehicles. So if your vehicle is covered in bumper stickers that advertise the fact that you have a gun, it's more likely that a criminal is going to target your vehicle for theft, and you might find your windows busted out. So be smart about how you dress when you're out in the public space and what you put on your vehicle. If you really value personal defense, you don't want it to be obvious that you have a gun. Dress like a normal human being and you'll be better off in general. Thanks for tuning in.
Remember, Armed Lutheran Radio comes with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you are not completely satisfied, the next episode is free.
So you have your concealed carry permit or license to carry. Now what? Now you need a good holster. Not one of those cheap neoprene prophylactic holsters you can buy in the big box stores. You need a holster custom built for the firearm you intend to carry every day. Check out cooksholsters.com. Made in the USA, Cooks holsters are available in a wide range of colors and designs for inside the waistband or outside waistband carry. They carry a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guaranteed. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and take 15% off everything in the store. You put in the time and effort to legally carry a firearm for personal protection. Protect your firearm with a custom holster from cooksholsters.com.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. I am joined again by our good friend, Pastor John Bennett of St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota, to take on another segment of Clinging to God and Guns. Welcome back, Pastor.
Thank you.
It's good to have you back. It's good to be together with you again. And this one is an interesting one that you found. I don't know how we overlooked this, but this is from May of 2015 by a guy named Krish Kandiah, the Christianity Today contributing editor. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about Christianity Today, it should be noted that Christianity Today is kind of a liberal Christian website. Is that a fair assessment, Pastor?
I would say in some senses, yes, as far as politics go. Mm-hmm. In other areas, it can be somewhat decent, but if you're looking for good, confessional, Christian stuff, it's not the source to use.
Yeah. This is entitled, Should Christians Own Guns? A British Theologian's View. And Mr. Kandiah apparently presents here lots of opinion, not a whole lot of facts. a lot of bad theology, and it leads me to believe that maybe he is the professor emeritus of the Mr. Bean School of Theology in London. It just... and for that reason, I'm going to do the entire segment in my Mr. Bean accent. So we'll skip the first paragraph where he kind of sets the stage with some recounting some tragic shootings that had happened last year.
All examples of people behaving irresponsibly.
Exactly, yes. A toddler shooting himself by getting a gun that the parents left out, police officer accidentally shooting his mother. It's all this kind of, yes, exactly right. Good point. So we'll move right on and get started. Let's see if I can do this. Some would argue that these tragic stories... I can't do it. I just can't.
We'll imagine it as that you're speaking in that accent.
I'm going to try it again. I'm going to try it again. See how far I can get with this, just for the fun of it. Some would argue that these tragic stories are reason enough for people to rethink their attachment to firearms, but apparently not. Not all American Christians are pro-gun, of course, but there is a sizable number who are. One of the more outspoken evangelical proponents of gun ownership is theologian Wayne Grudem, whose arguments I will critique here. I don't have any idea who Wayne Grudem is, do you?
Neither do I.
It doesn't matter. So here's Mr. Grudem's points, and followed by our author, Mr. Candia's counterpoints. His first argument is the constitutional right. The Second Amendment to the American Constitution states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. He did get that right. But Grudem argues that the reason for the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution to provide another protection against tyranny, to make it harder for any political dictator who would be king to take control of the entire nation against the will of the people. This concern is probably not the heart of the individual gun control debate at the moment, as the right to bear arms against a tyrannical dictatorship is a different question as to whether Christians need to own guns now in a stable democratic environment. That line got me because it doesn't mean just because it's stable at the moment that it's going to stay that way.
Right. Well, and look at what is going on in our country right now. We do not live in a stable democratic environment.
Amen to that.
If we lived in a stable democratic environment, Hillary Clinton would have been indicted. Politicians would not be above the law. Black Lives Matters wouldn't have an open invitation to the White House.
Right. We wouldn't have 5 police officers shot and killed in Dallas. You're exactly right. Yeah.
Amen.
We're quickly becoming a banana republic. Also, the fact that the Constitution allows something does not automatically mean that it would be appropriate for Christians to bear arms. Grudem has argued against abortion and gay marriage, both of which are allowed in many states, but that, according to Grudem's logic, is not sufficient reason for Christians to endorse them.
Well, first, I hate to burst his bubble, and why again is a Brit lecturing us about the intent and purpose of the Second Amendment? Beats the heck out of me. But Grudem is absolutely correct in what he says. The purpose of the Second Amendment, if you read what the framers had written concerning firearm ownership and the Second Amendment specifically, the two I think that are the best on that would be George Mason and James Madison. Right. They make it crystal clear that one of the primary purposes of both a militia, which, as George Mason had said, that it includes everyone, every single citizen, and the right to keep and bear arms. The purpose is specifically to be able to thwart the power of a tyrannical government. But here's the part that really kind of torques me off. He gives the straw man argument where he is more or less suggesting that the Constitution permits abortion and gay marriage. That is a flat-out lie.
Right. He's suggesting that because those things are allowed in some states, that it's the same as a constitutionally enumerated right.
Right. And those, gay marriage and abortion, those really are something that's been permitted by 5 out of 9 black-robed despots from the ruling from the bench. But let's take a look, though, what he says here. He says, the fact that the Constitution allows something does not automatically mean that it would be appropriate for Christians to bear arms. The two are completely inconsequential of one another. It's regardless of what the Constitution says, because a firearm is an inanimate object that is not in and of itself evil by any means, there is absolutely nothing that is inappropriate about a Christian owning a firearm. What can be inappropriate is how he chooses to use that firearm, but ultimately, there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever.
And, might I add, that gay marriage and abortion are frowned upon in the Bible, and the ownership of weapons is not.
Well, and think about it for a moment, too. Later on, he harps on the interchange between Christ and Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah, we get back to that again.
Think about it. Yeah, that seems to be the dead horse that just can't stop beating. But think about it for a moment. He is making the implication, at least, that it is inappropriate then for Christians to own guns. So if that is the case, if that could be proved from Scripture, it would be a much different conversation that Peter would have had with that Peter would have had with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
And all right, second point, self-defense, which for some reason he misspells and then spells correctly and then misspells again over and over in this paragraph. I'm not sure whether defence is the British spelling.
I believe it is.
Grudem goes on to argue that the right of self-defense should be seen as a fundamental human right, and governments should protect that right. Even if we accept the premise that there is a right to self-defense, this does not necessarily mean that you have a right to own a gun. There will always be limit to the expression of this right that would include a whole range of military hardware. Even Grudem recognizes that the private ownership of a machine gun or anti-tank rocket launcher or an anti-aircraft missile launcher are unnecessary. But still, he argues that private handgun ownership reduces crime as an attacker cannot be sure that their potential victim is unarmed. This next sentence really, this one I just scratched my head at. I really can't make sense of this next one. The counter-argument, of course, is that it could make gun violence more likely, as attackers could increasingly assume their victims are armed, not to mention that increased gun ownership means increased gun accidents.
The irony there, especially with those last words, is that statistically, since 2008, I wonder what happened in November of 2008, firearm sales skyrocketed. But at the same time, firearm-related accidents have been gradually declining. So,
yes.
I'm sorry, your reasoning there just gets blown out of the water.
He uses the word "could" repeatedly, and it could do this and it could do that, but hey, guess what? It hasn't.
Well, he's also saying that if more people are armed, that means that there's going to be incidents of gun violence where people are attacking other people because they're assuming that they're armed. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
That's just bag of hammers stupid. That makes no sense. So if an attacker assumes you're armed, they'll be more likely to attack you.
I don't remember where I heard this, but there was a poll that was done of felons in prison, and asking them if they were more or less likely to rob or attack someone if they knew they were armed. And
right,
almost to a man, they said that they would be less likely to do it. There aren't any biblical arguments that are made here, which seems to be par for the course for most of the article. But every single one of his assumptions here can be debunked just looking at statistical data. if the places in the United States, and we've talked about this probably just about every episode now, that have the highest crime rate and the highest incident of gun violence are those localities that also have the most stringent laws when it comes to gun ownership. But there's also, he talks about basically debunking this Grudem's argument that increased rates of handgun ownership can reduce crime. That's absolutely correct. There was a study conducted by Northwestern University School of Law, and in their study they found that there are approximately 2.5 million cases every year where a firearm is used in self-defense. And this is a relatively old study. This was the mid-90s. Just to give you some comparison, the Clinton Justice Department in that same period of time conducted their own study, and they came up with a number of 1.5 million cases. So let's err on the side of generosity here, just to be kind to our author. Let's say there is 1.5 million cases every year. That's 1.5 million incidences where someone who would have been a victim was not.
Right.
There was a study that the Obama administration directed the CDC to conduct, and their numbers weren't quite as high. The number that they had was 500,000. But that same study also showed that, and this should be no surprise, in those instances where a firearm was used in self-defense, the victims had far lower incidence of injury or death than unarmed victims. I wonder why.
Point number 3 is the protection of others. Grudem argues that carrying weapons would prevent tragic mass murders in which a lone gunman can hold at bay an entire restaurant or church full of people. They're much less likely to happen in states where a large number of people carry concealed weapons. But the counter-arguments are, firstly, that if guns were more highly regulated, then it would be a lot harder for potential mass murderers to get hold of guns in the first place. I got to stop right there before we go to his second counter-argument. How many criminals are legally purchasing weapons to commit their crimes?
Well, last time I checked, if you're a criminal, you can't legally purchase a firearm.
So that would be 0.
Correct.
It's already illegal, like you just said, it's already illegal for a criminal to go out and buy a gun. And even if they weren't a criminal before they committed their first crime, right? There's that argument that, they're only law-abiding until they're not. It's already illegal to kill. Well, that law doesn't stop anybody. It's already illegal to take guns into gun-free zones like schools. How is that working out? And how would new regulations...
Doesn't seem to be.
And how would new regulations make a difference?
Yeah, in so many of these cases, for example, Sandy Hook is the one that people like to turn to all the time. The killer in the Sandy Hook shooting killed his mother and took the firearm that belonged to his mother.
He broke 20 laws before he even stepped on school grounds.
Absolutely. They always bring up this talk about mass murders, and it's good to remember that just because a person doesn't have a gun doesn't mean they're not capable of mass murder. Perfect example, 9/11.
Right.
You had the Oklahoma City bombing. You had the Boston Marathon bombing. You have these incidents where there were mass casualties that a single gun was not used.
Right. The Murrah building in Oklahoma City, that not a single gun. All right. Secondly, Ellen Painter Dollar argues, quote, police officers go through hours of specialized training to help them discern when the use of deadly force is justified. As we know from not a few front-page tragedies involving police shootings, despite such rigorous training, even the best-trained police officers don't always get it right. Yet, we want to believe that an armed citizen with a few hours of practice on the shooting range will be able to make a split-second judgment well enough to ensure that the only people who end up dead are the bad guys. End quote.
We have this strawman argument here that it holds up the examples of police shootings to demonstrate why civilians shouldn't own guns, since police go through rigorous training and still make mistakes. I would say the exact opposite is true. It demonstrates that no matter how much training a person has, they can still make mistakes.
Yes.
The other side of this, too, and I'm sure you have probably seen this shooting IDPA. Sergeant Bill could probably attest to this, that there have been numerous cases throughout the years where innocent bystanders were shot by stray bullets that came from the gun of a police officer.
Right.
You have many departments across the country that the only time their officers are required to actually practice is when they have their annual qualifier. But conversely, you have many hobbyists like yourself and myself. We shoot on a regular basis. We sometimes will put more shots down range in a week than some officers will in an entire year. So in many ways, we're actually training more often through practice than many police officers are themselves.
Yeah, I agree. This when we see this a lot, this myth that cops are fantastically well trained. Sure, and please don't misconstrue this as some kind of bad critique of police officers. Cops go through training to become cops, and they get their badge and their gun, and they're only required to qualify once or twice a year, not counting the specialists or the SWAT guys, right? So
right.
For the everyday street cop, the cops who train the most, like Sergeant Bill, do it on their own time. They're not required to as part of their ongoing everyday job. Bill was telling me, he shot with me at the Stars and Stripes Regional last month, and he shot his Glock 19, and it's worn and beaten up, and it's got the finish all worn off of it, and it's because he uses it constantly. He trains with it. And he told me he took it to the police department armorer for something, and the guy looked at it and just was flabbergasted at what it looked like. He said, "What have you done to this?" And Bill told him, "Well, I use it. I shoot it. I train with it. I carry it." The armorer told him that most of the guns he sees are hardly ever used.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, and it's also this myth that police officers go through hours of training for this specific purpose of tactical scenarios.
Right.
The majority of the education that a police officer goes through is classroom time dealing with the law.
Right. It would be great if police officers got the training, if there was the funding, the time to teach them the tactical training to deal with these split-second decisions, because in a lot of cases they don't get a lot of that kind of training. Instead, thanks to the Obama administration, they're getting training on racial sensitivity.
Right.
That doesn't help them when they've got a guy who's reaching for their waistband, and in a split second you've got to decide, am I going to shoot this guy or am I going to wait and see what comes out of the pants? Right?
Right. You know, at the very least, what I would like to see happen is if law enforcement agencies would cover the range fees and the membership fees if their officers chose to do something like IDPA, giving them an allowance for ammunition. Because honestly, I can bet that the reason that a lot of these guys aren't doing it is a cost issue. And guys like Sergeant Bill, he's doing it on his own time, on his own dollar.
And he doesn't have a whole lot of time. I mean, they spend long hours on the job, and then they have a very little amount of time to spend with family, with their kids, to have some downtime. And that has to, then in that time, they have to squeeze in the training that they're not getting at work. So right. You're right. I think that's probably why a lot of them aren't training on their own. Bill is taking a lot of time out of his downtime with his family to make himself a better shooter and to be ultimately, I think, a better cop. All right, on to point number 4, one of your favorites, and that is sport. Hunting, a popular sport and for some a means of sustenance. That's not even a sentence. I just noticed that. That's not even a sentence.
Maybe it is in Britain.
The rules of English are different in Britain.
Well, so far we've seen the rules of spelling are.
That's true. Some argue that it would be an assault on civil liberty to restrict the use of guns for sport. I believe that an argument can be made for the ownership of guns for sporting and recreational purposes with the requisite licensing and monitoring. Gun licenses are available in Canada and even in the UK, but there are very strict regulations in place that involve screening of gun owners, registration, monitoring storage, and ongoing eligibility screening. In some parts of the US, it's possible to buy a gun over the counter in a supermarket. What the?
I'm going to run down to the Piggly Wiggly and pick me up a AR-15.
Honey, get us a gallon of milk and an AR-15 while you're out. Oh, my gosh. While in Canada, it takes 60 days and extensive background checks that explore mental, criminal, and addiction histories. Those seeking a license need to take a training course as well. The different outcomes are startling. And he goes on to talk about how there's a high rate of gun ownership in Canada, and there were only 0.5 deaths per 100,000 from gun homicide in 2009. But in the U.S., there were 9,100 firearm-related deaths, and then he misestimates the number of guns per household. We've corrected that. It's, 112? He says it's...
Yes.
He said it was 101, so... But this was May last year. We've moved up the ladder a bit.
Right. Well, and this is really a poor argument because you have two incredibly different countries. Canada, just out of curiosity, I looked up a map of the population density. Canada has roughly the same landmass as the United States.
Right.
But it only has 35 million people. That's less than the population of the state of California. When you don't have the population density, you're not going to have the same rate of crime. Exactly. It's just a simple fact.
Yep. And those 9,000 deaths, as you have pointed out in the past, those are mostly criminal gangs killing each other, right? So,
right.
And a tiny fraction are accidents or police shootings. Move those crime-ridden inner cities to Ontario or Toronto or Winnipeg or Calgary, bump up the black rate of unwed motherhood to 70%, and then transport all the street gangs to good old Canada, and I suspect you'll see a different result.
I'm sure you would. I'm sure you would.
The Mounties would not know what hit them. Perhaps instead, Christians might choose to lay aside their rights or even the pleasure they get from hunting in order to see fewer people die. This is the same logic, and this gets interesting. This is fun. This is the same logic that motivated the Salvation Army's no alcohol commitment from its members. When it was founded, the Salvation Army was doing so much work among the homeless that its members decided to lay aside the freedom Christians enjoy to drink alcohol in order to look out for the needs of those for whom drinking meant addiction. So gun ownership is like alcoholism.
I guess so.
That's full-on stupid. I'm sorry. Owning a gun is not an addiction. Alcoholism is an addiction. Having alcohol or drinking around an alcoholic is not a good idea because it will tempt them to drink. Having a gun around somebody who doesn't shoot, it might tempt them to want to try it, but it's not going to tempt them to go out on a killing spree.
Right, right. Well, it's also this old argument that if there's fewer guns, there's going to be, fewer gun deaths, fewer incidents of gun violence. But there's a lot of empirical data to support, or I shouldn't say to support, but to completely shatter his argument. Mm-hmm. I'll just give you a few numbers. I've mentioned Honduras before in our previous segments. Honduras has 6.2 guns per 100,000 people. But Honduras is also the homicide capital of the world.
Right.
84.6.
How is that possible?
Per 100,000 people, 84.6.
Good grief.
Now, the United States ranks at 3.9 deaths per 100,000 people. So it goes to show you that it doesn't matter how many guns per person. So obviously having fewer guns per person means absolutely nothing.
Nothing whatsoever. All right. Now we finally, after 4 pathetic points, we get to the theology.
Which is also pathetic, by the way.
Which is also pathetic. Point number 5 is the biblical precedent for owning a gun by a Christian. Then Jesus asked them, "When I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything?" "Nothing," they answered. He said to them, "But now if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." Luke 22:36-38. Grudem cites this passage and its parallel in Matthew 26:52 to argue Jesus wanted his disciples to have an effective weapon to use in self-defense. But surely this verse must be understood in the context of Christ's general teaching on loving enemies and peaceful resistance.
Here's the problem. That's not the context of those passages.
Surely...
Go ahead.
And surely Christ didn't tell his disciples to go buy a sword but not to use it. Go buy that sword.
It's like telling an Amish person to go buy a car but not to drive it. Well, the context, when it comes to taking Scripture and applying it to anything in our lives, we have to understand it in its context because,
yes,
it's you've got the passage in the Psalms where it says, blessed is the one who dashes their infants against the rocks. So let's not take that literally, please.
No.
So it's put it into context. The context of whether you're looking at Luke's account in chapter 22 or Matthew's account in chapter 26. These are Jesus' instructions to his disciples on the Tuesday of Holy Week. They're the instructions that he is giving them before he is essentially sending them out. Mm-hmm. He is preparing them for what lies ahead, both with his crucifixion as well as the coming persecution, because after this, the Christian faith is vigorously persecuted by primarily the Jewish ruling class, but then also, as we see later on, even more vigorously by Rome. So Jesus is preparing them for that. He's preparing them for the possibility of being met with violence. So to say that this needs to be understood in the context, he says, of Christ's general teaching on loving enemies and peaceful resistance, that's a load of hogwash.
Well, here's some more good context. There's the most misinterpreted passage from the Bible ever that we seem to run into every time we do one of these articles. It also needs the context of Christ's chastising of Peter for using a weapon to protect him. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And the fact that Jesus repairs the damage that Peter's sword did to the ear of the chief priest's servant, scholars such as the conservative evangelical Leon Morris argue that Jesus' command to take the sword is to be understood figuratively to bring home the fact that the disciples face a situation of grave peril. So, yeah. So
he talks about the context, but he's again ignoring the context. He's trying to claim that when Jesus instructs his disciples to go sell their cloak and buy a sword, that somehow in the context of Jesus teaching on loving enemies and peaceful resistance, and so it's to be understood figuratively. But he's completely ignoring the context of Christ giving those instructions to his disciples. That happens on the Tuesday of Holy Week, just before he's about to be betrayed, just before he's about to be brutally whipped and crucified before their eyes. Mm-hmm. In the context, Jesus is giving them instructions in preparation, even though they weren't aware of it, in preparation for dealing with his crucifixion. But he was also sending them out, and they would be encountering persecution. They would be encountering tribulation along the way. Right. They were going to be going into a very dangerous world. Also, keep in mind, following Christ's resurrection and then the establishment of the church on Pentecost, that's when the persecution of Christians is incredibly ramped up, both from the Jewish ruling class and then later on also from Rome.
And these and his disciples are going to be traveling to the four corners of the earth, and those aren't safe roads to be traveling back then.
Exactly. This also begs the question: if Jesus was saying that figuratively to his disciples, instructing them to arm themselves, then what is the correct interpretation then? That's the part that's kind of ironic, is they always try to say that this is meant figuratively, but they don't tell us then what Jesus actually meant.
Right. No, that's just a figure of speech. This is why we've seen this argument, this interpretation of this passage a number of times. Why is there this willing ignorance of what it is that Christ's purpose was in the garden? I mean, why do they interpret it this way? Do they really think that he just got caught by chance, and that if only he had been able to get away, he could have gone on preaching, or do they not recognize that his ultimate goal was the cross?
I think in many of these instances with many of these authors, if they were honest with themselves, if they were honest with their readers, it seems more as if they are simply grasping for straws to have some sort of scriptural justification for their position.
Right.
At least that's my take on it. But it's
putting the best construction
Jesus,
on it.
Right. And Jesus wasn't telling Peter to put his sword away because Jesus was a pacifist and hated swords and was offended by those who possessed them.
Right.
But because Peter was becoming a stumbling block to him progressing from Gethsemane to the cross.
Right. Yep. This next paragraph makes no sense to me. If Grudem were to argue that it would be unusual to take a command figuratively, I would point him to where Jesus says, "If your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off." Even if it is conceded that weapons of self-defense are biblically permissible, this does not necessarily mean the mass ownership of guns is the best way of applying this text.
Nobody ever said mass ownership was the best way of applying this text.
And Grudem isn't making this argument that it's a figure. He says he's arguing against something that Grudem never even said.
If you were hypothetically to argue this, I would hypothetically argue this. I think this is the first time where we've seen someone make a theological statement off of a hypothetical situation. No one is arguing that it would be unusual for Jesus to make any command that was not figurative or otherwise. He then quotes where Jesus says, "If your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off." Mm-hmm. And then contrasts that with Jesus telling his disciples to arm themselves, and trying to say that, well, if he's being figurative here, why is he not being figurative there? That ignores the context again, because when Jesus says, "If your eye offends you, pluck it out," and so forth, he is warning against someone losing their faith. Mm-hmm. He's making a statement there that because your eternal salvation is of so great importance, that if there was a part of your own body that was causing you to stumble and fall away, it would be better for you to cut that off entirely than to lose your salvation.
Right.
So this is what he's doing here is what I like to call comparing apples to fish tacos. Because the two have absolutely nothing to do with one another.
So it's almost like he's suggesting here that our gun ownership is a hindrance to our salvation. That we should get rid of our guns because that's holding us back. It's like the whole, the if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Well, if your gun is an offense, your gun is what's causing you, it's separating you from your salvation, separating you from Christ, separating you from your identity in Christ, and we'll talk about identity in a minute. So we need to get rid of it. We need to cut it out of your life. Is that what he's trying to say? It's what it sounds like.
Maybe that's what he's arguing.
That's what it sounds like. It's weird.
Maybe that's the way they do theology in Britain. I don't know.
At the Mr. Bean School of Theology. And finally, the final argument in favor of gun ownership is cultural identity. I wonder if we need to recognize that gun ownership is intimately connected to cultural heritage. In some states, there is still a cultural legacy from the frontier days up until the early 20th century. Garrick Rogner, an American theologian now living in Spain, commented to me, "There was no law in many places. Threat from Native Americans and bandits was frequent, and the U.S. had just finished the Civil War, so there were many young and damaged men with guns roaming the West, trying to put their lives together. Combine all that with the advent of mass distillation of hard alcohol, and the American West was a extremely violent place." So all the blacks and Asians and women and gays who are out buying guns in record numbers and getting carry permits are doing it because of drunk white guys in the Old West.
Yes. Yes. Because of crazy crackers with guns in the 1800s.
That's right.
It almost sounds like he gets all his information from the Old West from watching movies like The Hateful Eight. Oh, my gosh. It seems he's implying this argument that, it was okay to have mass ownership of guns in the Wild West because there wasn't the law in most places, and that now that we have police officers, that suddenly we don't need to have personal ownership.
Right.
It seems that's the argument he's making, but the truth is that throughout most of the country, there still is no law in many places. You look at some of these places that you can still consider frontier territory, places in the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Alaska, where there isn't a soul for miles and miles.
Right.
20% of the country's population lives in rural areas.
Right.
That's 65 million people that live in areas where if you call 911 and you get an operator and they get someone out to your place within half an hour, that's like best case scenario.
Right. Even if it's not a rural area, look at Baltimore last year with the riots where the police were ordered to step back and let it happen. Or Ferguson, or just because we have police officers doesn't mean that we're safe and that there is, that we're free from violent crime. And our intrepid author finishes up with this. Identity markers are often clung to because no one finds it easy to relinquish a part of their identity. We must be careful about being too glib about calling Christians to find their identity of Christ instead, partly because we're all on our journey, and partly because the Bible affirms the valuing of human culture. The Bible affirms the valuing of human culture? Where does it say? Where does it say that?
It makes you question his credentials, doesn't it? What would that entail? The valuing of human culture, would that include the culture that you find within ISIS? That you can consider that a culture,
or the Aztecs? And
yeah.
What about all the cultures that God ordered to be wiped out in the Old Testament?
Exactly. Last time I checked, what the scriptures affirm is the valuing of the human soul and of the salvation of the soul. You can make the argument that the Bible condemns human culture because human culture at its core would be something that is sinful.
Nevertheless, I believe the more firmly we find our identity in Christ, the less tightly we hold on to these other things. Every time a tragedy happens in the USA, whether it's a Columbine massacre, a Virginia Tech mass killing, or the Aurora movie theater killings, there is public outcry. Reverend James Martin writes, simply praying, God never let this happen again, is insufficient for the person who believes that God gave us the intelligence to bring about lasting change. It would be as if one passed a homeless person and said to oneself, God, please help that poor man, when all along you could have helped him yourself, which is exactly what Scripture states in James chapter 2, 15 and 16. I just realized I sound less like Mr. Bean and more like Mark Stein. So, this last paragraph, how does disarming law-abiding citizens and leaving them vulnerable to criminals help them?
You know, it's when you sit and you're quoting or referencing James chapter 2, 15 and 16, what James is speaking of there is the obligation of the Christian to have love and compassion toward his neighbor. So is he arguing here, the author, that by owning our firearms that we are somehow doing the exact opposite, that we are being uncompassionate and unloving? It almost seems like that's the case. He's making this assumption that Christian gun owners find their identity primarily in their guns, and then going on to say that if they would just give up their guns, they can primarily find their identity in Christ.
Right.
Ask your average Christian gun owner which they would prefer to give up. Would they prefer to give up their faith, their salvation, or their guns? If they were to say they prefer to give up their faith or their salvation, I would argue that they weren't Christians in the first place.
Right.
But I hate to break it to this guy, but Christian gun owners find their identity primarily in Christ. Our firearms are simply something that we enjoy by virtue of our Christian freedom and the freedoms guaranteed to us under the Second Amendment.
Right. We don't equate, the two don't even go together.
It's comparing apples to fish tacos.
Stop.
Hey, you got to give it to me. That makes more sense than anything he wrote in this article.
And with that, I'm going to call this one debunked. Well, thank you, Pastor, for enduring that one.
Well, it was enjoyable nonetheless.
It was. And that's going to wrap it up for another week. Thank you for listening, downloading, and subscribing. If you heard anything that you'd like to comment on, anything you got a question about, be sure to visit the show notes for episode 27. Leave us a comment or visit the feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback and send us an email or a voice recording. We'll play it on the air. Also, if you'd like to support the Armed Lutheran Pro-Gun Ministry, visit the recommended gear page on the website. Some neat stuff there on Amazon. Anything you purchase, we'll get a little commission from that. It'll help pay the bills. Or you can visit the Armed Lutheran shop and get some pretty cool swag. Or you could become a sponsor of the show by visiting Patreon at www.armedlutheran.us/Patreon, and you can make a donation there. Your support is greatly appreciated. Next week, we'll be joined by a very special guest, only the third woman to ever grace the cover of Field and Stream magazine. She'll be here to talk about women and guns, hunting, and much, much more. Christ's blessings on your week. Keep shooting. Keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ArmedLutheran. And like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thearmedlutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.